Thanks for coming. So today we are happy to have our colleague, Dr. Renia Lopez. So you know her, I believe, and she's assistant professor at our department, and the main area of her research is on gestures. She works on the relation between gesture and speech, and particularly in the second language context, how we teach a second language with gestures effectively. And she does a lot of research on the gesture use in second language acquisition teaching context. So today she will be sharing with us categorizing recurrent gestures, lessons from discourse markers. So let's welcome Renia.
Thank you very much, William, for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming. And I have to confess that when William asked me to prepare this was also to think about it. It was about 5 months ago, and at the time I was working on gestures and discourse markers. So I said, yeah, I'll do something on gestures and discourse markers. And then when I was preparing it, I thought, but no, wait a second. Some of you might not know much about gestures or much about discourse markers. I can't just go into that. And I have to go slowly, and assuming that some of you will not be familiar with either one or the other, I'm going to be telling you quite a lot about both. So I'm going to start with an introduction to gestures, general introduction, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how gestures are categorized, then about recurrent gestures, and that's where the discourse markers will come in, and then the implications of the work that we've been doing. And so, for those of you who do know about gestures, please forgive me. It might be a little bit boring maybe at the beginning, but hopefully it will pick up. So, the first thing, what are gestures? If you look at the definitions of gestures, you will find two things that recur in the definitions. One of them is that these are movements of the head, of the hands, or the body. And the main point is that these have this expressiveness, deliberate expressiveness. Within that big field of gestures, I look at gestures that co-occur with speech. So it's a subset of the bigger one. And these gestures are hand and arm movements that co-occur with speech. So in a situation like this, I have nothing to do with it, basically, because I do not look at the head gesture, I do not look at the body either, and I do not look at this type of gesture either. So what do I do? Indeed. And this gesture in particular is an emblem. In this particular case, it refers to first or one. First of all, emblems are codified gestures, and they don't need speech to be understood, so I don't look at those. Emblems have been studied for about 2,000 years. The Greeks and the Romans already looked at them with people like Aristotle and Cicero and Quintilian, and I think you will recognize some of these because our politicians today are still using the same gestures. Bear in mind that at that time they didn't have microphones, which meant that when you were addressing a large audience, your hands were really important. And today, some of these gestures are still being used. Not all of the Roman emblems are still being used. Some of them are, and you're probably familiar with them. Others have changed with time or with society. So for instance, the symbol for triumph, you probably wouldn't recognize it, but you might recognize this one. New gestures appear into our society all of the time, and I think one of the newest ones that we have today is this one. Yes? No? Okay, so in terms of the studies of gestures, as I mentioned before, we've been studying them for about 2,000 years already. And what has changed is the focus that we have given to those studies. So initially, we were looking mostly at emblems. And the Jesuits during the Middle Ages, they were very keen on emblems as well, especially for the liturgy, for the Mass. And later on, during the Renaissance, they began to look at gestures as ways of expressing emotion, and you see this in the fantastic Renaissance paintings in particular. But it's not until the Enlightenment period when we begin to see a study of gesture from a cognitive point of view. So there we're beginning to look at gesture with speech and the thought. And this line of study was dropped at the beginning of the 20th century, and it wasn't picked up until quite recently, actually, because during the 30s, gesture, when it was studied from a cultural point of view. And then later on, this moved from a nonverbal behavior point of view. And that is probably what you or most people associate with gesture, the nonverbal behavior element of it. So I'll come back to that in a minute. More or less in the 80s, that is when the cognitive point of view began to make its presence again, with McNeill, Kendall as well. And McNeill in particular suggested that speech, gesture, and thought formed a unity, and that we should be looking at the three things together. In the last 7 years that I've been looking at gestures, the field has absolutely exploded with journals, books, and from every possible angle. And I think one of the latest books that we have is from Simon Harrison here from CPU, who's one of our colleagues. And he talks about some of the gestures I'm going to be telling you about. So, going back to what I do not study, I want you to watch this video, pay attention to the content, but also pay attention to the hands. See if you can do both things at the same time. And remember, this is what I do not look at it. This is nonverbal behavior.
You're meeting someone for the first time, and you notice, for instance, as you did over there with the glasses, that you cover the neck or you bite the lip, and you're wondering, why am I doing this? What is the purpose of this? Ever wonder why we bite our lips? Why, when they're canceling flights, you see this aggregation of men and women, professionals, looking at that board in Atlanta, and they're all biting their lips. Ever wonder why? Because you can't suck your thumb anymore. Because you want to do this. Because you want to pacify. You want to relieve stress, but you can't. And all day long, we're relieving stress. We're doing it by doing things like touching our face, biting our lips. We go from one pacifier to another pacifier to all sorts of pacifiers in our lives.
Okay, so when you talk to me, please don't worry. I am not looking at your hands to work out whether you're nervous or you're lying to me. I have no idea. I am not looking at that. What I do look at is all of the gestures that are co-occurring with speech. And I don't know if you noticed, but he had quite a number of those. And let me just show you 3 of them that happened at the very beginning. Did you notice these 3 gestures? The first one was like this, the second one like this, and the third one was like this. Did you notice them? Yes, some of you are nodding. And he had many, many of them. And that is one of the problems when we study gestures, in that in 3 minutes, and there are so many gestures that you might spend about 3 or 4 hours doing the transcription and going through them. So it's actually quite time consuming. So let me show you these 3. The first one is this one.
For instance, as you did over there with the block.
This is a deictic gesture. He's using it to point to someone. You can point to an object or a place in space. And what's interesting here is that he actually points, and a little bit later he comes up with the word, with the lexical affiliate, you. And this is probably rehearsed, and that might be one of the reasons why the gesture and the speech in this particular moment is not as synchronized, because here I would expect it to be more synchronized, so you rather than you. Let me show you another one. So this is the one where he's putting his hand over to his neck. He's also referring to you over there covering your neck.
You cover the neck.
So this gesture is basically illustrating an action. It's a referential gesture that is iconic because he's basically making it look as it is. And then let me show you the third one.
The lip. And you're wondering, why are they doing that?
Okay, here we have two gestures. There was one he does like this, but the one I was referring to is this one. Those are the gestures I'm interested in. And these are the gestures that have been left aside in many, many gesture studies, because most gesture studies have been looking at the deictic ones and the referential ones. Why? Because they are the easiest ones to interpret. So the other ones, this one that he does first, and this one, these ones seem to have some sort of pragmatic value. And same thing as it happened in linguistics for years and years and years, pragmatics was left to the side. And we're seeing the same thing with gestures. Pragmatics has been left on the side. So it is only recently that we're beginning to look at them more carefully. Okay, so just to tie all of that a little bit together, the categorization of gestures, or rather different ways of categorizing gestures have been proposed over the years. But the one that has stuck the most and is the most popular is McNeill's. He originally suggested this in '92, and then in 2000 he made some changes. And what he basically suggests is a continuum in which gestures are placed depending on their relationship with speech. So at this end over here, you see sign language, which basically does not need speech to be understood. Then you have the emblems, which are the ones I was showing you at the beginning, all the Roman gestures. Pantomime, which would be movements of the hands in a sequence that basically perform an action. So if I was to do this, you would all understand I'm trying to open a jar, for instance. And then we have gesticulation or speech gestures, which are the ones I look at. These ones are considered to be idiosyncratic. That means that they're specific to the individual. And within these, McNeill proposed 4 subcategories related to the nature of the gesture. So iconic, metaphoric, deictic, or beats. And one of the points here is that a gesture could be more than one of these things. It could be 3 or 4 of those things. So the beats are these gestures that look like patterns that we can use either to stress a part of the utterance or to keep the rhythm. You will see more of these later. Then we have the ones with iconicity, metaphoricity, and the deictical ones, which could be pointing like this, it could be pointing like that, or with a finger, this various ways. My problem is that gesture that we saw before does not really fit into any of these. Yes, you could say, well, maybe it's got some referential, yeah, maybe it's got some of the beat to it, yeah, well, maybe it's got some of the deictical, yeah, but it doesn't actually fit nicely into any of them. So, and the work that I've been doing over this last 7 years has been following in methodology what McNeill started in his lab. And what they started doing was asking participants to narrate the story of Tweety and Sylvester. So for those of you not familiar with this, Sylvester is a cat that is forever trying to capture the bird, Tweety, never succeeding, and partly thanks to Granny, who is always protecting the bird as well. So what we did is we've been asking participants to watch the video and then tell us a story. And then we analyze those gestures. So to give you a couple of examples, here we have a male from Iran, and he is describing a part of the story. When you read it, it looks really disfluent, but actually when you hear him speak, it's not that bad. And I'm going to show you the bit in brown. Unfortunately, the audio is really, really low, so you just have to believe me. But look at the gestures, that's the important thing.
After that, he
Okay, so here we've got 3 gestures. 2 referential, the owner came, hit him with an umbrella, and then we've got this last gesture, like this. Let me show you another one. So this is a Hong Kong female, so both of them are speaking in English as a second language. Hong Kong female, so again, similar story, and she says,
he comes up and then he tries to catch the bird.
so again, we've got 3 gestures here. He climbs up. I know you cannot see very well because of the face blur, but he climbs up, catches the bird, and in the middle we've got another gesture, which is again very similar to this one. It's a cyclical gesture. This time just with one hand, while the previous one was with 2 hands. These gestures we find recurring in different speakers of different languages in different contexts. And they have been termed recurrent gestures for that reason. And before I came to this term, I was classifying all of these gestures that I didn't really know what to do with them under the term discursive, because to me they had a discursive function, most of them. I'll come back to that in a minute. And there is where the recurrent gestures fit in as well. Cornelia Muller last year suggested a change to McNeill's continuum, and as you can see here, she put recurrent gestures in between the emblems and these gesticulations, or what she calls singular gestures, which are the ones that McNeill had identified as being idiosyncratic. But now with these gestures, what we have are gestures that have a form meaning that is quite stable and are partly conventionalized. They're not completely conventionalized, so we cannot call them emblems, because even in the 2 videos I showed you, what the lady uses one hand, the gentleman uses both hands, one is saying and then, the other one is saying again, so it's not quite the same, but I think the meaning is understood. And these cyclical gestures have been studied by Habry in particular in French, but we see them in German, we see them in English, we see them in Spanish. Then going back to this new categorization of this change, Cornelia then looked again at the singular gestures. And let me skip this quickly for a minute. Sorry, I have just deleted the bit I needed to show you. Oh, here it is. Sorry. And so Cornelia looked again at this categorization of the gestures. In particular, she looked at the referential gestures. And she thought that this idea of iconicity and metaphoricity didn't really make a lot of sense, that it would make a lot more sense to talk about gestures from the functionality point of view. So then she came up with these 4 ways of categorizing them. So gestures, referential gestures that reenact an action, she whacked him, that draw or trace a path, for instance, that mold, show you the shape, or that represent a piece of paper and a pencil. Yeah, and that's how she categorized them. This was done in '98, and it's only now that this is beginning to receive more attention. And this still didn't really help us with all of these gestures, these discursive gestures which are recurrent. But this idea of functionality caught my attention. And it caught my attention specifically when I was doing a study on gestures relating to temporal markers. So I was looking at how we express time when we say before, after, where do we place them in space? And what I found, I found that they were all over the place, actually. That's another story. But with all of those temporal markers, we were also looking at the marker then, in the past, then. Only that when we began to analyze all of that, we realized that then, in that particular situation, was not a temporal marker, but a discourse marker. And the function of that discourse marker was really, really varied, same as with discourse markers. So you could use them to add new information, to express an inference, to express a consequence, so quite a number of functions. So I began to look at discourse markers. Is anyone familiar with discourse markers? Does anyone work with them? Yes. Well, those of you who do, and those of you who don't, my know by now that discourse markers are a minefield. There are many, many different frameworks and points of view, and there are different definitions of discourse markers, and there are even different categorizations of discourse marker and what is and what isn't a discourse marker. So you could look at it from a grammaticalization theory, from argumentation theory, from relevance theory, and they're all slightly different. But I found one that seemed to work, and that was more of a functional, from a functional point of view. I carried on digging about this functionality framework, and I came across the work of two Spanish researchers, one of them Borrero Zuluaga, the other one Lopez, who had developed this framework based on an Italian Basnella's work, who had also proposed this framework for discourse markers in Italian, and in Spanish it also worked really well. So I began to look at it, and what they were proposing, this is for discourse markers now, they were proposing three functions: a meta-discursive function, an interactive function, and a cognitive function. And what they were saying is that discourse markers could actually be multifunctional, so you could have more than one functions, and also that the discourse marker acts not on the element that it accompanies, but usually on the whole of the utterance. So I was looking at this, looking at my gestures, I'm thinking, this is exactly it. This is the same. I thought, this just fits so well. So I thought, okay, let's take this and see whether it does work or not. Now, I've got to tell you that this idea was not new, because it has been looked at before. And not only did Cornelia Muller already look at this functionality, but Koch and his team have also been looking at functionality perspective for gestures. And as you can see here, in terms of the representational or referential functions, they amplified a little bit the possibility. And they looked at these meta-communicative and textual functions based on systemic functional linguistics. The really interesting thing about these guys is that they have actually tried it with people. And one of the problems in gestures is that if I do this gesture, you might or might not guess that I'm talking about hitting. Yeah, maybe if within context you might work it out. But most of the time it's really difficult to work out the semantic equivalent of the gesture. What these guys did is they did tests where they were looking not at the semantic value of the gesture, but at the functional value of the gesture. And what they found is that in an above average number of participants, they could actually guess correctly what the function of the gesture was. So this seems to work. So I decided to look at the corpus that we had and see whether it did work or not using this functionality framework or this functional framework. We looked at both Spanish speakers and English speakers. With the Spanish speakers, we look at L1 Spanish speakers and L2 Spanish speakers. we had 12 and 12 here. And for the Spanish L1, they produced, sorry, we were looking specifically at the marker, the discourse marker then, which in Spanish is entonces. And we had 23 entonces in the L1, 31 in the L2, and as you can see, a very high percentage of gestures co-occurring with the marker, which in itself was quite strange, because we tend to associate the gesture co-occurring with a verb, with an action, or at most maybe with a noun, or if you're describing a space, for instance, with something related to the space. So this was quite surprising. The other thing that we found is that in most of the cases, the gesture actually corresponded really, really well with a discourse marker, as in starting at the same time as the marker and finishing more or less at the same time as the marker. So it was obviously correlated to that marker. And in terms of the meaning, it was also correlated to the marker. Just to give you a couple of examples, we had the utterance and we analyzed it linguistically, and we agreed that this might be the pragmatic functions that it has. Looking at the gesture, we find a gesture opening up. This is a well-documented recurrent gesture that gives information, is offering something new to the interlocutor. It is being stressed by reason of there being a gesture. And in this particular case, we had it open up and then it did this. And which when you watch it, you associate it with the idea of, because of that, a consequence, which again was matching quite nicely with the linguistic interpretation. Another gesture, completely different, with the same marker. Our participant did this with the entonces, the equivalent of them. To conclude, this is a conclusion. And again, when you do the linguistic analysis, it also has that meaning, as well as presenting information or stressing information. When we look at the L2 gestures, so the L2 speakers, what we found is that we could see the same gestures, and yet linguistically, when we analyze the speech, the pragmatic meaning was missing. It just wasn't there in many cases. Not surprising, because many of our L2 speakers were intermediate or low proficiency level speakers. So that linguistically, they just didn't have the tools to express that pragmatic meaning. And yet with the gesture, they were able to do it, because pragmatics, or there are many things shared among pragmatics in different languages. When we looked at then in English, this was a pilot study, so we didn't have many participants. There were 2 from each one of these countries, so 2 L1 speakers, and all the other ones were L2 speakers. And with these guys, we found 95 occurrences of then. And in this case, only 65% occurred with a gesture. In the other one, we had 81 and 91%. And out of all of those gestures, only 27 out of those 95 were actually related to the marker. There were quite a number of them, 35, which were not related. They actually referred to the content that followed the marker, usually an action. And in particular, what we found is that we had quite a number of gestures referring to giving new information and indicating a consequence. So again, we looked at these, and one of the explanations that we have come up with is that the marker entonces in Spanish has more functions, more pragmatic functions than the marker then in English. So there is no need to differentiate all of the functions as much as there is in Spanish. As I mentioned, this is a pilot study, so that we're carrying on working on this, and we also need to compare how speakers of both English and Spanish perform in both of them because there might be other factors affecting it. How does this affect me in the work in my teaching? Well, the implications for me as a second language teacher of Spanish, I think are quite obvious. But the first one is that in the classroom or in the language teaching classroom, we seldom teach pragmatics. If you look at any textbook, you will be lucky to find anything on pragmatics. So perhaps through the gestures, we will be able to add that into our teaching. And we've already started looking at it. And basically what we're doing is we're analyzing the pragmatic element of the gesture in native speakers and then asking the second language speakers, the learners, whether they can identify the pragmatic element and how they would incorporate it themselves into the speech. The other thing that this allows us to do is to check whether a student is having problems conceptually or linguistically. So basically, if the student is giving me the gesture that implies a concept, but is unable to tell me in the speech, I know that there's a gap in there, and as a teacher, it's a gap that I might be able to fill, having identified it. And then the last point that we're working on at the moment is, can we eventually use gestures to identify the proficiency level, be it at these pragmatic ones or the referential ones. At a much larger scale, there are two questions that gesture researchers look at. So the first one, are gestures communicative or cognitive? Now, up till now, there were many gestures that were, as I said before, left on the side and thought to be only cognitive because they couldn't be interpreted. But perhaps many of those gestures do actually have a pragmatic function that they are fulfilling. So I am not saying that that the cognitive side of things is not there. It is there. And for instance, if you didn't allow me to gesture, I wouldn't be able to talk probably. So it is there. But perhaps there's a larger communicative element, a much larger communicative element than we thought. And the second question that gesture researchers work on is, how do we actually process gestures? So when there's been a number of neurogestural studies, and many of them are similar to this one by Shu Emery and their colleagues. And this was done in 2009. It's probably one of the first ones that was done. And here they were looking at emblems and pantomimes. So basically gestures that have a very clear semantic speech affiliate. So they ask people to watch the gesture and also to hear the speech to see which brain areas were active in the processing. And what they found is that they are common areas to the processing of both the gesture and the speech. And these areas are the ones close to the Sylvian fissure, both in the superior frontal gyrus and in the temporal cortex, the posterior temporal cortex. And the interesting thing is that both of these actually deal with semantics, both of these parts. Not surprising then that they are both engaged with the pantomimes and the emblems, because those have a very clear semantic context. However, in a more recent study done in 2016, bringing together all of the studies that had been published up to date, and Dick and Brose found that, I don't know if you can see the colors very clearly, but they found that there were areas in green which were common to both speech and gesture, but there were also a number of areas in the brain that were specific to language and others specific to gesture. The gesture ones are not in this picture, but the speech ones you can see them. Again, not surprising because you would expect some motor areas to be related with gesture processing and some phonological areas to be active during the speech processing. However, in a recent study published a couple of months ago, Juralev and her team actually came out with the opposite, that gesture and speech are not processed in the same areas. And the implication of what I have just presented to you comes back to this. What they studied, the way they did this study is they had videos of natural gestures, of people just speaking. So they had both referential and pragmatic gestures. And they had the participants watch and hear the equivalent, the speech, as the brain scans were being done. The mix, I think that mix of referential and pragmatic gestures is what has given them this result, that there are different parts of the brain that are being lit up as these are being processed. If they were able to divide the referential ones and the pragmatic ones, perhaps what they will find is that the referential ones are indeed being processed in the same areas, both speech and gesture, whilst the pragmatic ones might not. The pragmatic ones, you might have the gesture being processed in one part of the brain, whilst the pragmatic speech might be somewhere different. I don't know. This is my hypothesis, and time will tell. As you can see, there's a lot of work has been done on gestures, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on it. We've been at it for 2,000 years. I don't know if there's room here for another 2,000 years of work, but certainly for a number of years. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, if you're interested in gestures, be it the hand gestures or any part of the body, please join us. We have just opened up the International Society for Gesture Studies Hub in Hong Kong. So this is an international organization. We have opened it up here in Hong Kong. We are very, we would like to welcome as many of you interested in the field of multimodality overall and gestures in particular to join us. So if you're interested, you can just go online and you'll find more information about us and about what we do. And there will be more gesture events over the next months. So please come and join us. So before I finish, let me just thank very much, first of all, Cyril, who has been working with me for a number of years, and he's been invaluable in all of this. And also all of the participants that have allowed us to collect all of the data that we have collected. As you can see, they're all anonymized with the heads chopped off. And finally, to thank the two research centers of the Department of English, because the work that we do falls under the Research Center for Language Teaching and Learning, or the Professional Communication Center. Most of the work that I presented to you today is under this, but there's also work on gestures under the Professional Communication Center. So thank you very much. That's all I have to present. And I will answer questions, but only if they are easy questions. So thank you.
All right. Okay, thank you so much, Renia.
Sorry.
Really, I believe this is really a new field for many of us and so exciting. So we have 20 minutes for questions. Okay.
May I ask a question about taxonomy? So could you please turn to page 32? Yeah, slide number 32.
This one?
Yeah, this one.
Yep.
So I noticed molding. I think it is quite similar to iconic gesture. So what are the differences?
Well, all of them can be either iconic or metaphoric. Yeah, and they're all referential. But what Cornelia was trying to do here is to move away from that iconicity and metaphoricity, because it gets really complicated sometimes to be able to decide if something is iconic or metaphoric. And by making it functional, it's actually a lot easier to categorize gestures. And it seems that we respond much better to this way of categorizing them, as Kovchekian and the team have shown. The fact that we can actually understand the functionality without the speech.
The two are somewhat related questions. The first is with different types of gestures, do you see cultural differences? So Chinese versus the Western speakers, and if so, how these might translate into the first versus second language differences. So is it, for example, I mean, the Chinese people probably don't do this as much for conclusion. I don't know, but if they do, does it mean it sort of co-evolves with the proficiency in the second language? So these are
Okay.
two related questions.
So, yes and no. What we are seeing is that there are, especially with these recurrent gestures, that they do actually recur across cultures. So we are seeing them in all the nationalities that we looked at already, both in the L1 and in the L2. You mentioned this not very often seen in Chinese. I wish I had kept the various slides I had. We have them in Chinese in Hong Kong speakers over and over and over. Could it be because they are speaking in a foreign language? Maybe, but we also do see them in the L1. So maybe there are more in the L2. Maybe that's one of the things that we are looking at, how the gestures change with proficiency. And I said yes, culturally, because yes, there are differences by culture, but they tend to be more related to the amplitude of the gesture and sometimes even the speed of the gesture.
So, for example, has anybody done a study doing the Tweety bird story, first in the first language and then in the second language, or vice versa, to counterbalance?
Yes, there are quite a number of studies on that, and that is one of the things that we do as well. So we do use the same story, because if you use the same story, you could say that but the video we use, there's a whole lot of videos of Tweety and Sylvester, and the events are more or less the same. So we use usually the first half of the video in the L1, the second half of the L2, or vice versa. So yes, but in L2, what they usually say is that there are more gestures in the L2 than in the L1. From what we have seen so far, it seems that many of those gestures are actually these discursive gestures. I keep calling them discursive because they're recurrent. I don't know yet whether all my discursive gestures are recurrent. So that's why I keep calling them discursive. But what we are seeing is that there are more discursive gestures in the L2 than in the L1. And I personally believe that might be related to the proficiency. So that's one of the things that we're looking at.
Thanks, very interesting. So I have a question about the analytical process, the part about the co-occurrence between discourse markers and gestures. So this reminds me of dissociation or independence. So, but you seem to examine cases where they co-occur, cases where there is a discourse marker but no gesture. How about the other two cases where there is a gesture but no discourse marker? Because I think we need to know the frequencies of those two.
So we're looking at those as well at the moment. And yes, you get discursive markers discursive gestures without the discourse markers. And in particular, what you get is during disfluencies, you get the discursive gesture when there is no speech or when there is a disfluency. So and then you see the gesture. The other case would be
Neither. So neither the marker nor it depends on what unit you define, right? Because you need those two. If not, you cannot conclude that they are correlated.
Yeah, and we also so in the case of the then and the entonces, We also looked at how many of them didn't have gesture. In the case of Spanish, there were you had them in there. So 91% had gesture. So very small number didn't have a gesture. But in English, the number of them without a gesture was much larger. It was 33%. So yes, we're also looking at that. But we have also looked. Our corpus has been fairly small. What we have looked at is fairly reduced number of instances. So yes, we need to look at a lot more than that.
There's actually a very big database online, like the TV News Archive, things like that. So
Yes,
observational data.
the problem with TV is that you never know when it has been rehearsed. And as the case of the Joe Navarro video that I showed you at the beginning, some of his gestures might not be spontaneous gestures. I think they are rehearsed. So we've got to be a little bit careful with that. The other issue is that in theory, we are not allowed to use TV data unless we have the consent of the people that appear in the TV show, in theory. In theory. And the other issue is that by using TV shows, we cannot, we have content which is all over the place. At least this way, when we give them the stories, we know more or less what the content is going to be, which helps us in the transcription. Sorry. Well, 1, 2, 3.
I have a couple of ideas, thoughts, questions related to the other person involved in the communication. So, is there any kind of a combination going on? If you are talking to someone else who uses a lot of gestures, do you then change the frequency,
Yes.
change the type?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and there are studies that show exactly that. There is actually quite an interesting study, and that goes back to what you were asking actually, in which they had students talk to a teacher and students talk to a friend of theirs, telling them the same content. And what they found is that the type of gesture changed completely. The amplitude was reduced when they were speaking to the teacher, and also the speed of the gesture was reduced. So yes.
And then that's related also to, I wonder whether a lot of the participants are your students, and I wonder whether they're getting, I mean, if you're in a Spanish class and you have limited Spanish proficiency, you get a lot by the teacher gesturing things. So I wonder how much they might be mimicking the teacher's gestures back to you.
Yes, it could happen. Out of these, maybe 5 of them have been my students. The majority of them have not been my students. Not only that, I don't always do the interview or the session with them, so they are not talking to me directly. They're usually talking to Cyril, and they don't necessarily know him.
Okay.
So we are trying to eliminate all of those elements. The very, very first ones that we recorded, yes, they were my students, but as I said, the majority of them now.
Thank you.
Yeah, just follow up of Lily's question. So can I take it that the more you proficient in the second language, the closer the gestures will be with the so-called native speakers?
That's what we think, yes. However, there are a number of studies done with bilingual speakers, and what they are showing is that bilingual speakers apparently gesture more than monolingual speakers. So there's obviously something else in there, because it's not just gesture like a native, there's a little bit more to it. And I personally believe that it might be related to the cognitive knowledge associated with the gesture. One, you know that your interlocutor is going to find it easier if you're gesturing. And 2, maybe there is an element also of finding the right words with your gestures. Maybe.
Yeah, can you learn or can you teach gesture? Because you seem to suggest that, the implication for language teaching was that this was something that students, you could use as a teacher, or you could learn, you could teach it.
Yeah.
I'm thinking back to when I first came, I taught a subject in Hong Kong on public speaking, and I remember that I felt that I had to get these Chinese students that I was not familiar with to use more gesture, because I think they were just, they just stood there. But it wasn't natural. So, and I remember having that discussion where they said, I don't do that, so it doesn't come natural to me. So is there something we can teach, learn, or is it something we should teach, learn?
Well, yes, it can be taught. Yes, it is. It is being used in teaching. Yes, it is being used specifically in teaching of second language, especially vocabulary, and because it is believed that this follows the idea of the embodiment, that if you embody the concept with the whole of your body, basically. So if you associate a gesture to the concept, you're going to be able to remember it much better. And apparently that does work. We've done it in the classroom. We have worked with gestures in the classroom, and what we have found is that it does work. We've looked specifically at the pragmatic functions, not so much the semantics, but the pragmatics. And yes, students are able. I don't know if it is a matter of remembering better, or if it is understanding it better. I believe it's the understanding bit. So yes.
Listen, I'm trying to just follow up with that, maybe from the perspective of teachers. I remember, did we talk about, or did you do that, teachers who use more gestures to indicate ISFQ? Or
Yes.
Is it any kind of gesture, or is it you have to use the right gestures to get a high ISFQ?
Okay.
Yes. We can't. Gesture is we can't take it as one single variable, right? There must be all kinds of gestures, and how do how can we design all that?
And this goes back to what I was telling you at the very beginning. So gestures much more than the hands. It's also the head, the body, and everything. Yes, there are also studies. This goes back to an idea proposed in 1973 called immediacy, that suggests that there are certain body movements that you can do, and also behaviors that do help with your SFQs. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I have been using some of them here today. One of them has been using my hands, because apparently using your hands does help with the SFQs. The other thing is the little walk. So not standing still and walking a little bit. There are other obvious things like smiling, for instance, and making eye contact. So those as well. However, we have done a study on these particular things in our teachers here at PolyU, and I have to say that it wasn't very positive. So basically, we were not able to say, yes, definitely, if you move your hands, you're going to have a better SFQ. There's obviously a lot more that goes into it. Yes.
Sorry, can I mention a little anecdote? When I first came here in 2005, I got consistent comments about my gesture from my students, and they were annoyed. They said, "Can the teacher please sit down? Stop, using his hands and his feet and so much." So I had to learn over time to restrict myself and, not sort of walk around and do exactly what you're suggesting at the moment. Maybe it's a change over time, but I think they were just not used to it, and they found it annoying. They said it's difficult to focus on what you're saying because you move around and you use your hands all the time, and it's distracting. So this is just interesting information in relation to what you were saying.
Yeah. Oh, maybe.
All right. Do you have any more questions?
May I ask a question about the recent published studies, slide numbers 15.7 and 15.8?
So these ones.
Yeah. 57 perhaps. Yeah. So
Not so recent anymore. Yeah, 2009 is a long time ago now.
I also came across a similar study published in 2011 perhaps. But I wonder whether, for example, this study, so the video and the speech, are they congruent?
So was they? Yes, I believe. Yes.
Okay.
But bear in mind that what they do is that they have the people look at the gestures and then they have the people listen to the speech.
So mono.
Yes,
Mono
yes,
model.
yes, yes.
So no combining.
No,
two
no combined. In this
modalities.
particular one, I don't believe it was combined.
I just wonder, has there been any study that whose design is that one modality is gesture and the other modality is speech? These two are incongruent.
Yes, yes, there have been. There have been studies on that. Yes, and what they find is that it is harder for the interlocutor to process the information when it's not congruent. So yes, yes,
Longer processing time.
yes, yes,
The study also looked into like brain.
yes,
Okay.
yes, yes.
Okay, do you have more questions? Remarks? And stuff now. Thank you very much. If you're interested in Renia's work, you can go to our website. You can check out. She has a recent paper in Journal of Dramatics analyzing how teachers say no without, how teachers disagree without saying no. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right.